Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's always hard to follow right after lunch, so I'll try really, really hard not to put you to sleep. I need a little information. So how many of you are winemakers or in the winemaking field? Okay. How many of you are growers? How many of you are just interested in wine and here to learn more about Cabernet? Okay, there's a few. How many of you are from Northern California, from the North Coast, Appalachian? All right. How many of you are from South or Central Coast? All right. And how many from the Central Valley? We've got a nice geographic representation today. So as long as we're playing question answer here, I'm really good at interrogating people because I had three teenagers. They've all grown up, but. How many of you have ever heard of Coal Ranch Appellation before? Okay, well, we're lucky today because we're going to get to taste some Coal Ranch wine. It's as rare as Opus 1 out of a barrel. So, but anyway, let's get started. So I'm the wine growing and plant science advisor in Mendocino County, and I'm going to talk a little bit about history in our two counties about when Cabernet really got started. The first plantings were probably put in by John Parducci and Charlie Barra, who, if you are in the North Coast, have probably heard of those people before. And they were small scale. They didn't even show up really. I noticed on the Acreage report this morning when Charles was talking, they didn't even show up until the late 60s. But early on, both Charlie and John Parducci figured out that it would be good to get more than 39 cents a bottle for wine, which was about what it was selling for back in 1950. And they knew that if they switched to varieties, that maybe they, French varieties especially, maybe they'd have a better shot. As I understood it, the prevailing wisdom back in the Russian River, say in 1940s, was that you couldn't really grow red grapes further south than Healdsburg, and Zinfandel is what you grew if you lived in Healdsburg because it could ripen a little bit easier. There was less fruit than Carignan, as they call it locally in Mendocino, and they love Carignan because they were paid on sugar points and it had an extra ton or two on top of Zinfandel, and that's how kind of most of our industry was either Zinfandel, Petit Syrah, or Carignan until the 1950s and 60s. Another person who made a try at it was Dr. Ed Meads in Anderson Valley. He put some Cabernet in 1964, and it just failed to ripen. So in the 1970s is when the big boom really started in Mendocino County, Lake County to a lesser extent. And, Cabernet at first wasn't always really the best thing to grow because we had it in the wrong places and we had virus stocked and poor vineyard design. So the 1980s we started to see improvement, and by 1980s we were pulling out some of those 1970s vineyards because people were in such a rush to get into the wine business. They were planting things on their own roots, and of course phylloxera cleaned those out pretty quick in about 15 to 20 years. And then also drip irrigation was really a major breakthrough, and it allowed people to start going upslope and grow into the places where red grapes really belong. And I'd say in the 1990s to present, the newer plantings in the higher elevations are really kind of finding us where we need to be. So what do we know about Cabernet? I'd say that it's a variety that likes warmth but not heat. It seems like around 3,000 hours is really about right for it. And most of the places where your degree summation is between 2,800 and 3,000 hours, that's a good place to grow it. So caveat to that, it can't come all at once. So we really need to have kind of a long growing season for the fruit to properly mature. And it likes sunlight. You really need to have a site with a lot of luminosity. So in our counties, where we're finding is up on top of the ridges is really where it seems to do well. And it likes soils that are deep but not particularly fertile, because if we have too much fertility, then we start getting into problems with veggie flavors. A long fall ripening is a really nice thing to have for the best balance, because we don't want to get sugar ripeness and then no resolution of tannins. So, in our county, because we start a little bit later, we're bud breaking 2 to 3 weeks behind Napa and Sonoma. We're ripening at really more ideal temperatures. We're ripening in October, and already it's starting to cool down. So we don't really see a lot of September picking in Lake and Mendocino counties. Here's a look at acreage, and Charles covered some of this. You can see that Mendocino has the least of the 4 North Coast counties, and the average price per ton is really pretty disappointing. The average price for Sangiovese is actually higher in Mendocino County than Cabernet, and Sangiovese is not exactly a red-hot variety these days. But last year, the average price for Sangiovese was about $1,600 a ton, and the average price for a cab was down here pretty low. And it's primarily because there was a surprising number of lots that went out for $350 a ton, which was really kind of a shame, because that fruit certainly was worth more than $350 a ton, but it was kind of a sort of a last-ditch attempt for growers to at least get something back. And just as Charles showed some sort of just bargain basement prices in Napa, certainly the same thing is happening in Lake and Mendocino. And of course, Napa at the top of the heap there. Lake County is doing a little bit better than Mendocino, but not a lot. And we have same sort of problems. I think that a lot of people planted the 1990s thinking that they were going to be supplying these kind of coastal variety programs that a lot of the wineries were doing. And since the consolidation of wineries, what we're seeing is that the trend is towards lower priced fruit into the cheaper bottles of wine, which I think is bringing quality down, but nonetheless, everybody wants to buy wine for as little as possible, it seems, except for a small number of people that are really willing to lay a lot of money down for wine. So just to get you a little bit familiar with our region, because some people don't really exactly know where Mendocino and Lake County are. So Napa and Sonoma down here, and then we sit on top of them. So we're not very far from either location. We're part of the North Coast American viticultural area, which you hardly ever see on the label anymore. What I would say about our region is that microclimates really are us. This is a very, very diverse area. Primarily the distance from the Pacific Ocean sets our climate for us, and the amount of marine influence that we get. The topography is really rugged. We're part of the continental overthrust zone, where the Pacific plate and the North American plate hit, and the resulting collision created the Mendocino Mountains on the west side of the Russian River and the Microclimates Mountains on the east side of the Russian River, and that's where the divide is. And most of the Cabernet tends to be in the Microclimates Mountain area in Mendocino and Lake County. The geology is highly variable, so we find on the west side of the Russian River, it's mostly uplifted marine sandstones with Franciscan rock, a lot of basaltic rock high in magnesium. And on the other side, we start to get into volcanic type series, as well as the same sort of soils we'd find on the west side. So the geology is really mixed. Elevation, slope, and aspect vary really greatly. So, we don't really have a lot of flat real estate in both counties. And at high elevation, the vines start growth late and they ripen late, but it's a really interesting pattern. It's quite different than a lot of the other North Coast. So we have stratification of air at night, so it kind of settles and gets still, and it actually stays pretty warm. There's an inversion right there about 1,600 to 2,500 feet. So our night temperatures, particularly late in the summer, tend to be warm. It may be 50 degrees in Ukiah, and then at, say, 1,700 feet at the Eagle Point Ranch on the Microclimates, it may be 70 degrees. So we start late and we ripen late, but we get a lot of warmth towards the end of the season. And by day, there's a fair amount of convection at that elevation. It's fairly breezy, and we really notice this in Lake County, in the Red Hills area, which is south of the lake. Normally, it's a little bit cooler than it actually is down in Lakeport by the lake, because there's fairly good winds that are getting mixed up from the interface of the Pacific Ocean and the California landmass. So here's what it looks like. You can see it's pretty rugged terrain. So down here is Santa Rosa, and over here is Napa. Then we're kind of north of that, and this is the Microclimates Mountains over here. This is the Mendocino Mountains, and then this is the Olabali Wilderness. And in a sense, we're really kind of on the edge of the Pacific Northwest, because when you're in Mendocino County, it seems more like Oregon a lot of times than it does like California. And that's sort of the dream of a lot of Mendocinians. When they retire, they want to move to Oregon, because they have relatives there anyway. Climate and sunlight energy are really important in where you plant Cabernet. So there's two conditions that are okay. One is you need to be above the fog if you're in the Mendocino Mountains. So we don't have a lot of Cabernet in there, but we have some. So we want to be above the fog. We don't want to be down in it, because if you're down in it, it means in the fall when you're trying to ripen your fruit, it's getting very cool. And you have a lot of humidity and also the potential of frost. So we need to be above the fog line if we're going to do these late ripening red varieties. And beyond the fog is okay too, which is sort of Lake County's condition. They're getting more into a continental type climate pattern of weather, not so much coastal influence, but we can't be down in the fog. That's Pinot Noir and Chardonnay country. And frost is something that we reckon with all the time. This year is a good example. In Redwood Valley, we had 24 nights of frost protection, and Lake County was about the same. And as good as we are, a lot of us got blitzed on the night of April 20th, where the dew points were really, really low, and we had a large advective freeze. And even though we turned on our frost protection, we still managed to get a lot of injury because we turned on too late. We should have been on at 37 or 38 degrees, not 34 like we normally do. So we've lost about a third of our crop in Mendocino County, and we haven't quite assessed it yet in Lake. And in Lake County, snow is pretty common in the winter because we're getting up pretty high elevation in Lake. Clear Lake is right around 1,300 feet, so most of all the vineyards are above that. Again, going back to degree summation, it's useful to talk about the regions from this basis. You can see that Bordeaux right around 2,800 degree hours, about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Yorkville about 2,900. Hopland right around 3,100, and then Red Hills at 3,600. So, we're going to need to be up around that 3,000 degree hour range to really do a good job with Cabernet. So we're not going to find this in the cooler portions of our county. Distance from the ocean sets a lot of that, and it's pretty amazing. In a relatively short distance from 14 miles in Philo from the Pacific Ocean to 48 miles from the Pacific in High Valley, we've gone through all 4 Winkler zones, basically. So High Valley is getting warm enough that it's pretty, usually region 4. It's a high region 3 or low region 4, depending on the year. Here's a couple soils that are pretty important for Cabernet in Mendocino County. On the left is Talmage gravelly loam, which is kind of mixed alluvium. I still think that that's one of the best places to grow Cabernet Sauvignon. It seems to really like to have mixed alluvium with some depth. And I think it's because Cabernet really responds well to well-oxygenated soils. It doesn't really like to have high water tables or excessive moisture during the growing season. Red vine clay loam is derived from sandstones, and the old adage about chocolate milk comes from brown cows, therefore red wine must come from red soils is a pretty good adage, and we see a lot of our best red wine vineyards do have red soils, and they can be quite different. So this is a sandstone derived type soil, and it's very, very good for Petit Syrah and Cabernet and other red varieties. Now we're going to take a little trip across this area and actually see what it looks like on the ground. There's the Pacific Ocean at Point Arena. Point Arena has a lighthouse, and what happens here is that the San Andreas Fault is leaving California and headed out in the Pacific Ocean. So it's kind of a landmark. And there's a vineyard to our back. It's the closest vineyard that I know of in Mendocino County that actually produces something next to the Pacific called the Piper Ranch. And they're growing a combination of chestnuts, Pinot Noir, and sheep for making sheep cheese. The first area we come to where Cabernet probably makes some sense to grow is Yorkville Highlands. And Yorkville Highlands it looks like Oregon in the background there because we're kind of in this really interesting climate where we're at the headwaters of both the Navarro River, which flows through Anderson Valley, and also Dry Creek, which flows through Sonoma County. So it's up a little bit elevation. A lot of the vineyards are around 1,500 to 2,000 feet. A lot of timber soils, a lot of these reddish-brown soils, especially red vine soil. And it's a relatively new appellation. Not a lot of plantings in it, only about 300 acres and maybe 30 or 40 growers. There it is on a map. You can see up here, Anderson Valley, and down here, Alexander Valley. Still staying in the Mendocino Mountains, but getting to the edge of the Russian River. Now we're looking at some of these vineyards that up off the Russian River floor, but still have some pretty nice Talmage gravelly loam soils where we grow Cabernet. This happens to be the Bonterra vineyard that's owned by Brown Forman, or Fetzer, as you also might know them. And this is farmed biodynamically, and there's quite a lot of Cabernet on the west side of the Russian River in these kinds of sites. There's the Russian River itself, and that's mostly Chardonnay country. We tried planting Cabernet there in the 1970s. It was a disaster. It looked like pink Kool-Aid. It was just totally the wrong place. It does really good Chardonnay and Cabernet Sauvignon, but here, now we're starting to see some of the escarpments leading up to the Mayakama Mountains, and in here is kind of where the first Cabernet starts to show up, is on these locations here. That's looking south towards Sonoma County. And in the Microclimates Mountains, we'll find some pretty good sites for Cabernet in Mendocino County. The Talmage Bench, which again is kind of a little alluvial fans and escarpments leading up to the Microclimates Mountains on the east side of Ukiah, is another place where we have some good Cabernet being grown. Redwood Valley, now we're climbing elevation, we're up to 1,000 feet. Ukiah's right around 550, and then we climb up to Redwood Valley. The season's getting shorter. But again, if we get up on some of the higher benches, and we can find some very nice cab coming out of Redwood Valley. So what I'm starting to point to is that we got to go up to really find the right locations to grow Cabernet in Mendocino and Lake County. We're not going to do this in the lower parts of the landscape. Now we're at Clear Lake. Clear Lake is a very interesting place from a geology point of view. I first arrived there as a botanist in 1974, having just graduated from Humboldt State University, chasing after unusual plants that grew out, particularly on the east side of the county. Because the geology is so mixed, there's actually a lot of very rare endemic plants to Lake County. Things that you don't normally see too, like Sargent cypress forests, are pretty rare in California, but they grow in Lake County. The Clear Lake itself is quite old. I guess it's estimated to be somewhere around 30 or 40 million years old, which makes it one of the oldest lakes and freshwater lakes in the United States. And it's shallow, and it's not really clear. It's actually loaded with all sorts of little organisms and life. And this is a dormant volcano, Mount Canopy. Last time it blew its top was about 10,000 years ago. And there's a pool of magma sitting under there about 3,000 feet that makes it one of the biggest pools of magma closest to the surface. So I think if you're really into crystallography and mysticism, that helps to explain why Lake County is a little different. So here we are looking at the appellations. There's one big appellation called Clear Lake, which goes around the lake. And then this is the Red Hills, relatively new, and then this is High Valley, which is the newest. The Cabernet soils that are really important there would be the Aiken Bottle Rock series, which has a lot of this kind of stuff, obsidian, which was traded all over the West Coast because the Indians loved this for making arrowheads. And when they started planting the vineyards up there in the 1990s, they came up from Napa knowing exactly what to do, which was that you rip and cross-rip. And they started pulling up boulders the size of Volkswagens, and they decided they probably better quit that. And they started doing precision ripping just down the rows. And this bottle rock is kind of a trial, because if you're disking and bringing fragments up, they like to pop tractor tires. So they learned pretty quickly that A, you should probably use track layers, and B, you should probably go to no-till as soon as possible so you don't have to deal with these obsidian rock fragments. The soils are quite different, even though they're red colored. They're volcanic parent material, and they have a relatively high pH, pretty low magnesium and phosphorus, and pretty high potassium. So you actually have to do some phosphorus fertilization in some of these places, which is just about unheard of. We never hear about having to put phosphorus in a vineyard, but both Mendocino and Lake County you do, because they have sort of opposite conditions going on. In Mendocino, we have low pH, so sometimes we have high aluminum activity and sometimes phosphorus gets tied up. But in Lake County, we have high iron activity because of the high pH and the high amount of iron minerals that are in the soil. So Manzanita is the other soil. It's very similar to Aiken, except it doesn't have all of the obsidian in it. And they both have they're both volcanic parent material. A big valley around Kelseyville and Clear Lake is actually pretty heavy, high magnesium soils, coming mostly from the coast range, from the opposite side of where the volcanic activity is. And there we grow mostly Sauvignon Blanc because that's what's best for that location. This is a picture of the Red Hills area. They're fairly large plantings. Most of the vineyards are over 100 acres in size, and this happens to be Andy Beckstoffer's vineyard. And again, the climate is, like I said, starting to get kind of Pacific Northwesty, and this has probably been touched up a little bit in Photoshop, but nonetheless, it does look a little bit like Vermont or something in the fall, because we have enough deciduous trees, a lot of black oaks, and other things that we do get a change of seasons that are very, very marked in Lake County. And then finally, on our little trip, now we're about 48 miles from the ocean. Here we are in High Valley, and High Valley is kind of getting into chaparral country, and we're still the same reddish Manzanita soils, really up and down. Pretty good place for growing red fruit because we don't have much trouble ripening. We don't have frost protection in a lot of these vineyards, which normally is not an issue because we're up high enough in that kind of lovely little banana belt where frost doesn't settle down. However, April 20th showed that every once in a while we're going to get a frost, and it did damage. And I'm going to talk a little bit about results from a Cabernet Sauvignon clonal trial. It was actually planted by Jim Wolpert, and it was done in 1991, a 7 by 10 foot spacing vineyard. It was budded to 7 clones in 1992. They were all FPS clones. It was done replicated, 5 replications of 7 vines, and it was done with a divided canopy trellis. This was more or less what I would call a grower production vineyard. The idea was to grow a fair amount of fruit. We weren't looking for, the kind of yields that make winemakers happy. We were looking for the kind of yields that make growers happy. And data was collected from 1998 to 2000. So here are the selections that we had. We had clones 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10, and 21. Kind of a nice cross-section of 1990. This was more or less state-of-the-art, I guess. Maybe Jim can comment on that later, but these were the clones that people were interested in. Again, looking at some of these things for high-quality potential, things like clone 6 and clone 2, but they also had low yield potential. I like what Dan Berger says, is that if quality is related to smaller crops, then the logical endpoint is the highest quality vineyards have no fruit in them. This might be the year to take a look at that theory in some of our vineyards. So here's a look at the vineyard as it looks today. So it's a kind of a narrowly divided canopy, and I think we're moving away from divided canopy vineyards in a lot, at least in our area, because the expense of farming is getting kind of high. So if we're going to do it, there's not going to be a lot of separation in between the fruiting areas. We're seeing this with some cane prune Cabernet Sauvignon as sort of a modified vertical shoot position trellis system. Is really what it is, and we're letting it do a little of a California sprawl with short cross arms above it. So, anyway, to do this right gets quite expensive. This is right now, so obviously there's a lot of shoot thinning that needs to go on to get this up into good shape. So here's kind of taking a look at yields, and the magic number here is 10 kilos per vine. These are stacked, these are yields for each clone by year from 1999 to 2000. So at 10 kilos per plant in this spacing, you're looking at about just a little under 7 tons. So that's what growers would think is just great. If someone's paying you $1,000 a ton, that's a really happy place to be. And of course, winemakers don't think so. So even at 5 kilos per plant, that's probably more what winemakers would like to see down around between 3 and 4 tons per acre. And you can see some of the clones definitely lean that direction. So clone 6 predictably does not have a very big crop, neither does clone 2. But every once in a while, these things really pour it on. So in 1999, we just had a phenomenal set, and you can see we're going up over 15 kilos of vine, which is way too much. But we didn't thin any of the fruit in the trial because this was just to see what these babies would do if we put a little extra fruit on them. And they'll do quite a lot. There's our average clusters. If you look at them from year to year, if you follow the points from year to year, you can see that there's not a huge number of differences on clusters because that's kind of determined by pruning. And I forget now how many buds we pruned to, but we had pretty much the same cluster number most years. There was not huge significant differences between the clones. However, from year to year, there are big differences. So some years, like 2000, 1999, we really put a big crop on. And 2000 also was a pretty respectable crop. There's our yield to pruning weight ratios, and you can see that we're kind of all over the board, but mostly it almost looks like we could put more crop on there because we're down around 2.5. So it says to me that we still had a lot of vegetative growth in that site. And that actually was a fairly fertile site. I mean, it would not be my first choice of where to put a Cabernet vineyard, but it was pretty typical of the times of where Cabernet was going in. Here's our average cluster weights, getting up around 120, well, somewhere between 90 and 120 grams most of the time. Significant differences between the clones, again with clone 6 having pretty small clusters, the lightest, also clone 2 being down there, and then some of the others having quite much larger clones. So clone 8 being kind of a standard, you can see that that's typically pretty big. Interesting about Clonal, it stayed about the same through all 3 seasons. It really didn't vary that much, where some of the others did. So it seems to be a pretty consistent producer, which is probably why people like Clonal. Here's something that the average cumulative degree days to full ripen were right around 2,900 hours at least. The thing that's kind of interesting is 2000 was the only year that I thought things were really good and ripe. I didn't get to call the shots in some respects about picking this. It was based on the grower wanting to go in and get stuff for the winery, and they like to shoot for 23 and a half. And this was the only year where we really went up to full ripeness as far as I'm concerned, which was around 25. And there is a percent bricks. You can see that in 2000 we really got stuff good and ripe, and the other years we're picking 23 or lower, which, you know, probably okay for you know, kind of low-end Cabernet, but for high-end, most winemakers would not find that acceptable. One thing I would say, though, that is interesting about our region is that we ripen a little bit differently because everything's happening later. So the plants is naturally starting to go into sort of a senescence where the leaves are starting to come down, and even though we may be at lower sugar than you typically would pick Cabernet at here in California, we still have quite a lot of ripeness when the seeds are brown and you're starting to get some resolution of tannins in the skins when you taste them. So that's one of the advantages of being kind of in these high elevation situations. There's the average berry weights. They're pretty consistent. You know, there's slight significant differences, but they're pretty consistent from season to season. They're fairly stable. And the pH also pretty much our pHs tend to be below 3.7 most of the time, so we have pretty strong fruit flavors, good acidity. And there's the acidity. We're right around 0.6 to 0.7 grams, most of that being tartaric. So just to kind of summarize this, the Lake County Wine Grade Commission helped pay for this along with the UCCE Lake County office. Steve Tillicky was my technician, and Rachel, Myron, and Jim were all responsible for making this work.